It's This Week in Creationism, episode 38. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and here we talk about the headlines from creationism from this past week. Once again, we're going to focus on just one story for this particular episode. Ken Ham has penned a very short article in which he talks about peer review, or talks about an article that talks about peer review. And it caused me to ask the question, does his journal fare any better? And is his criticism of peer review a valid criticism? Now, I've been involved in the peer review process myself. I've reviewed well over 100 journal articles, and I've published 50 journal articles in peer-reviewed journals. So I have some experience with the peer review process, and I want to share some of that with you while talking about Ken Ham's reflections on peer review. Let's get started talking about peer review, Answers in Genesis Research Journal, all of that and more coming up. So if you're with me in episode number 37, I apologized for having a little bit of a rant about Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis. And I'm afraid my mood hasn't lightened a whole lot after reading this article about peer review. But I hope that I'll be able to provide something instructive when I provide my evaluation of what Ken Ham has to say here about the peer review process in science. And so what spurred my interest and caught my eye is this article, What If Science Isn't Very Scientific? By Ken Ham, October 13th, 2022, on his blog on the Answers in Genesis website. And in the title screen or the title shot here, he has this image from another website, Follow the Science, ? Scientific journal publisher to retract hundreds of manipulated peer-reviewed papers. It sounds pretty bad that scientific journals have to retract papers that have been manipulated by this peer review process. So let's talk about that paper and talk about Ken Ham's response. Let's start with Ken Ham's, introduction. And then I want to dig into a little of Ken Ham's own sources and how much his journal relies on peer review or not. So let's dig into this particular article, what Ken Ham has to say about it, and then begin to talk a little bit use that as a springboard to talk about peer review in the scientific process. So here we have Ken Ham starting his article, Science is one of the golden calves of our day. Many people worship the scientific process, believing whatever scientists say is absolute truth. Wow, I mean that's certainly not the experience I have. Even as a professor, teaching in class, I don't get the sense that my students just look at me in awe and think that I am speaking absolute truth to them. Of course, I'm very careful also to define the scientific process and talk about the goals of the scientific method and how we answer questions, and also addressing what questions can be answered and which ones can't be answered by the scientific process, setting the stage correctly. But Ken Ham here is presenting a particular view of what science is as if it's the answer to everything, or thinks that people think it's the answer to everything. Going on. And those who are even so much as hesitant to jump on the latest bandwagon, if you don't believe everything that scientists are saying today, then you're a science denier, right? So there's only people who absolutely believe what scientists say and genuflect to every word that dribbles from their mouth, or you're a science denier. And standing in the way of progress. But then he asks, what if science really isn't so scientific? If what's so great about science is this scientific process and the peer review process that leads us to potentially a better and better understanding of the physical operations of this world, what if that isn't so scientific? And so he brings to the attention of his audience a recent article. A recent article is just one of many that are calling attention to a big problem in the scientific literature, fraud and corrupted research. Then he goes on to talk about how this article It's talking about how a bunch of articles have to be withdrawn from scientific journals because fraud had been found in those articles. And so because there's been fraud found in some articles, maybe that casts doubt on the entire scientific enterprise. Maybe science isn't so scientific, right? Now, before we go on and talk about what else Ken Ham has to say about the scientific process, let's go look at his source. All right, let's look at where did he find this information that he's bringing to his audience. And so I went and looked up the article that he refers to, and he does have a link to it at the top of his article. All right, so it takes you to this site, LifeSite. I had never been to LifeSite as a website. And the article here, Follow the Science, scientific journal publisher to retract hundreds of manipulated peer-reviewed papers. First thing to notice is this is an opinion piece. And so this is on a news site, and it's an opinion piece, somebody who's trying to shape your opinion about something. Look at the subtitle here. Correcting the situation will not be easy, but a first step would be institute criminal penalties for research and review fraud. I mean, when I read that, I knew right away that this is going to be a pretty extreme article, a pretty extreme opinion about what to do about research fraud. Not that there isn't types of fraud that don't deserve actual criminal penalties. But let's see what kind of fraud we're talking about in this case first. Second of all, I have to bring to your attention, what is LifeSite? And you might be forgiven for not knowing about this particular website, this news website. Like I said, I had never heard of it either. One of the reasons I hadn't heard of it, and I'm sure Ken Ham will say that, this is my fault and this is my prejudice for not knowing about it, is that LifeSite is pretty much banned from Facebook. It's banned from Twitter. It's banned from YouTube. And the reason that this website is banned from these different places is because they have consistently been shown to promote a variety of different conspiratorial views. Coronavirus isn't real, anti-vax stuff, a whole bunch of other things that they have promoted in the past that has consistently gotten them into the trouble to the point where they have been pulled, like their website material has been pulled from a lot of different locations. And so I know that this particular topic about retraction of papers is a concern within the science community, and it's been written about in the scientific community. It's been written about by popular publishers or popular news sites about issues with the peer review process. And so he could have found one of many other different places to push his audience to read an article about this, including, prestigious journals like the journal Nature, all right, which has talked about the internal failings of its own journal and how they're trying to fix those things. And I'll show you that in a moment. But no, what does Ken Ham do? He points his audience to this alt-right conspiracy-laden website. It makes me wonder where he found this. Where does he come up with this material? It looks like this is the kind of place that he follows. And he can't follow it through YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. I mean, he's obviously following it through his own alternative social media markets that are then hyping and promoting this type of material, these types of articles that bring him to a location like this so that he reads something like this. And it's like, this is really important stuff. I got to bring this to my audience. The problem, of course, is that this is an opinion piece in an alt-right place that is going to have a very strong opinion that is quite divorced from the reality of the situation, in my opinion, right? Having some experience in this area. I don't know who the author is. In fact, I don't think there was an author on this, which is always a problem, too, when somebody's not willing to put their name on an opinion or an article. So this is the source of Ken Ham's information. So I'm going to suggest right away, one problem is that Ken Ham not been involved in the peer review process, himself, right? He's not a scientist. he doesn't publish. Now, he has his own journal that has an editor, and they do something they call peer review. And so he probably thinks he knows about the peer review process. He certainly tries to talk about science all the time. But how does he inform himself about what science is and what science does? He gets his information from locations like this, which are promoting a particular agenda. They're filling his mind with things. I mean, I find it ironic that one of his biggest concerns is that he's concerned that Christians are polluting their minds, right, with misinformation. You know, that they need to be very careful about their sources and who they listen to and so forth. And yet he places himself in a very dangerous position by himself being influenced by these particular kinds of sites. And he's not going to view this as him being influenced. He's going to view it as, I don't trust the mainline media, right? The majority of scientists and the majority of all these other journals and news locations, they're promoting misinformation. And because I believe sites like this about some of their positions, he just implicitly sort of has this faith that they're telling him the truth about all these other topics. And that's a very dangerous place to put yourself. That is why you will bury yourself further and further and further in conspiratorial type of thinking. And so now Ken Ham is, rather than using standard sources that have a little bit more legitimacy behind them, has to resort to referring to these types of articles in order to cast some kind of aspersions on the scientific process, which is just it's a way of undermining mainstream science or the conclusions of mainstream science, because, of course, he wants to reject a lot of mainstream science and their findings on a lot of different topics because he thinks it contradicts the biblical message. All right, so LifeSite. Now, to what this article is talking about. Now, I read the LifeSite. It's really short. It's like 3 paragraphs. And it's basically saying, oh no, there's been hundreds, there is a publisher that is ready to yank several hundred, actually it's like over 500 published articles, peer-reviewed articles. And the reason they're pulling those is because they have found various forms of fraud and manipulation of the peer review process. Now, some of those are that there was improper use of the peer review process in the sense of the editor maybe knows the particular person that's submitting it and then gives it to people that he knows is going to approve of that particular research. Are going to be friendly toward that particular write-up or something like that. Or maybe they didn't actually do like 3 reviews when they promised to do 3 reviews. They only did 2 reviews or only found 1 reviewer. Or maybe the editor himself just approved the article without really getting other reviews, in which case it's not truly peer-reviewed. In some cases, they actually find fraud, right? I mean, there's no doubt that there are fraudulent papers that have been published, which would be based on like made up data or improperly obtained data. And so there's a number of different technical reasons. There's a number of different fraudulent reasons. There's a number of different, I just didn't follow the protocol reasons why articles might be withdrawn. And so in order to increase the legitimacy of that particular publisher, we might say, like, we're going to withdraw these articles because we found out that our we have an editor who is just like approving articles without really getting them actually peer reviewed. They need to go through this peer review process. So sometimes retractions don't always mean like there's something wrong with the data or that their conclusions are wrong. It's just that the proper process wasn't followed. You can think of it as like it's kind of a legal thing. Now, I don't want to poo-poo at all the fact that there are hundreds of articles that have been withdrawn from peer-reviewed scientific literature that have been removed because of downright deceitful practices, right? In which faculty, in which authors have manipulated data to obtain the results that they want to get. In which they have found a way to get peer reviews for something that, even though maybe the data is accurate, they're not really portraying the data in the light that they should, and a reviewer should have noticed that there's irregularities in the data, and they're overseeing that. They're passing by that kind of stuff. So there's a problem, right? Just like there's a problem in it's like all social structures have inefficiencies, inequalities, and downright fraud in them. And that's not going to be any different in the peer review process. Not going to be any different for scientists, because as Ken Ham says, scientists are sinners too. And there is pride. There is trying to get to the top of the heap. There's attempts to get into journals that you might not otherwise be able to get into by misportraying data. Now, the reason I have what's on the screen here is because this is the particular publisher. All right, Hindawi is a large conglomerate that publishes well over 300 journals. And so they've been buying up journals all over the world and the rights to journals. And they have a whole network of editors for all those different journals and reviewers or boards, editorial boards. And they are an open access. They're all open access journals. So as you can see here, open access publishing for the scientific community, minimizing the impact of research through openness. Freudian slip there. Maximizing the impact of research through openness, because science works best when research is open. Now, you may have heard, and I don't have the hours I need to fully discuss this, so I'll give you the light version. You may have heard there's a lot of disputes within the scientific research publishing community about just what the best form of publishing is. And there is, over the last decade, been a strong push for something called open access publishing, right? And if you've ever tried to go find a journal article in a scientific journal, and you run up against those paywalls, right? You don't work at an institution like I do that has access to all those different journals and it has paid for the journal access, right? You run up into that paywall. It's like, we want you to pay $59 in order to be able to see this particular article. It can be very frustrating because they're closed access. They're only accessible to those people that have library access or that are members of that particular journal. And so open access is just what it sounds like. It's like, this is open. This is open to anybody to see, right? There's that little symbol where you have like the little thing that's open. It's like, yes, I can read this article. Anybody in the world can read this article because it's open. And a lot of even closed access journals now publish some of their articles as open access. So they just like, here you go. Here's a few little nuggets for you that you're able to read. You might think on the surface that open access sounds like it's wonderful. It's what everybody should be doing. It's what science should do, because it shouldn't just be for the privilege to be able to have this access to information. Well, there are flaws. There are pros and cons to both closed and open publishing. One of the flaws of open access publishing is that it's really, I want to say it that way. Many times open access can become pay for access. And what I mean by that is a journal or a conglomerate that runs a bunch of journals like Hindawi, it's a for-profit company, right? Unlike a society, which has dues for those members and that gives them privileges to be able to publish in their journal, they still might have to pay some charges for publishing in their journal. But they're not going to be nearly as much as it would cost to go to an open access journal. These open access journals are mostly private companies, all right, or even publicly owned companies that have to show a profit. And how do you show a profit if you're in publishing, right? Even peer-reviewed scientific journal publishing. You're going to have to make money somewhere, and the way you make money is you charge per page or charge per journal article that gets accepted. Now that creates a situation where the journal wants to have, if it wants to be respected, it needs to publish good stuff. And so it needs to have a good review process, and it wants to assure the audience that this has been looked at by a bunch of peers that understand this material, and that what you're seeing has been vetted in a way, right? The data has been vetted such that you can use this data maybe for your own research, right? You can refer to this data, you can apply their data, add their data to your data, and trust that there's accuracy there. The problem with open access is that because people are paying because the journal makes money, the more times it accepts a journal article, there is a incentive, let's say, to accept more articles, right? There are journals out there that are like, a bunch of people can submit to it, and they can just say, I'm only going to accept these, the best of the best, right? I only have a limited number of peer reviewers. That's a big problem with the peer review process. It takes peer reviewers, and there's a limited supply out there. There's so many publishers now, and there's fewer and fewer of us, people who do reviewing. And it's very stressful to be like constantly asked to review by so many more journals. And so you either turn those down or you don't have as much time to review. And you're going to do a better review process for maybe a journal that you're a member of, and that you really care about that particular field of study, and you then take a much closer eye. You take it more seriously. I mean, I would say that I take every review I do seriously. What I do is I just don't accept doing a review for ones that I don't feel like I'm going to have time to put my effort into. So anyway, coming back to this whole open access thing. So now what you have in open access is you have this incentive to accept as many articles as possible, because you don't get paid if you don't accept the article. If you reject it, you're not going to get the $2,000, $3,000, $5,000, sometimes more. So this company right here has hundreds of journals, and every one of those journals you have to pay if you're going to publish in that journal. I mean, you can get waivers sometimes. You can plead that you don't have any money and you get their grants and so forth. But nonetheless, generally, especially if you have the money and you're not even asking for a waiver, you're basically saying, look, I'm going to fork over $2,000 or $3,000 to you if you're willing to publish this paper. And so the review process can get a little lax, I think, in these situations. And it's been shown to be problematic. And guess what? It's been shown by a semi-scientific process. There are social scientists and scientists who test this system, right, by writing crappy articles and then submitting them to a bunch of different journals and seeing how they get reviewed to see what gets caught, what doesn't get caught. Will it just go right by the editor? Will they just take your money and publish it? And so I've done another video on this. And if you look back, it's about what we call predatory journals. So predatory journals will be like the worst case. That's the end of the pendulum, where you have journals that, I'm not going to say they're illegitimate because they're not doing anything illegal, but they are so bent on they'll publish practically anything you give them because you're giving them money. And they have peer review, but you really wonder what that peer review is. All right, so Ken Ham, I don't think really understands the spectrum of this in the scientific arena, that there is high quality peer review and there's really low quality peer review. And if you're a scientist and in your particular field, you know which journals have better peer review and which journals you respect and trust the data from. And other ones you're like, okay, I'm leery. Right? Even though it's peer reviewed, I don't just automatically trust it. I don't just like, oh, they're a scientist and they published this paper, I must believe it. No, not at all. I'm going to be highly skeptical. Right? There's really bad articles out there, really bad ones. And that's part of the scientific training process, is to be cognizant of this and be aware of it. If I wish all peer review was super awesome and never had a problem, that's unrealistic. And it's unrealistic that there isn't going to be fraud. And there is fraud even in the top journals. All right. So even in the very top journals, of course, to get at the very top, there's also a lot of pressure for individual scientists to fake data in order to make really splashy type stuff. Well, for example, I mean, I think most people are aware of one of the famous articles that came out that linked autism to vaccines, right? That article's been retracted, right? Now, the problem with that article being retracted is that a lot of people don't know it's been retracted, and, people that are into the, vaccines cause autism thing really glommed onto that paper, and they refer to it, and they still refer to it over and over and over and over again. As if, well, look, there's peer-reviewed journal article in a really good journal, and it shows that vaccines are connected to autism. And so that is rightfully a problem with the peer review process, especially with retractions, when people don't notice the retractions or intentionally don't notice the retractions and want to continue to use that original paper. Now, I don't want to cast big aspersions on Hindawi. Hindawi is the journal. I mean, in a sense, what they've done is they've self-policed and had others look at and examine articles published in a wide variety of their journals. I would say my impression is that they're kind of a second, third tier journal. That is, they don't have any like top tier journals. They have like mid-tier journals and lower. And some of them are probably not that great. And so they probably do have editors that are hired. They have reviewers that aren't doing a very good job. And they've noticed that, and they're retracting a whole bunch of articles that don't meet their criteria for a whole bunch of different reasons. When you put it in the grand scheme of things, in terms of like, I think this journal, they say they publish like 25,000 articles a year. So 500 is a lot, but 500 isn't over the past year. It's over a bunch of different years. And so as a percentage, it's still a very small percentage that has been identified, right, through a process of people who are intentionally trying to find out whether there is fraud, whether there is improper publishing, whether peer reviews are being influenced, whether editors are not really using the peer review process in the proper way. And so although I think it is definitely a problem that everyone needs to be aware of, and I think it's a growing problem, I agree that it's a growing problem. It's a growing problem partly because of what I said before, the number of people publishing is going up. And that's partly because the scientific enterprise is a worldwide enterprise, right? There's countries in the world now that are, well, especially like China and other places, that scientists there are publishing hundreds of thousands of papers a year that 30 years ago weren't. And so there's a massive influx of manuscripts that are going out to journals, and this is why there are so many more journals. I mean, the number of journals is increased exponentially. But the number of, I'll say, qualified reviewers isn't exactly increasing exponentially. All right, so if you have experts not increasing exponentially, but you have the actual manuscripts increasing exponentially, what does that mean for the workload for those experts? Right, the workload's going way, way up, and it's becoming very difficult for journals to find reviewers. They're begging for reviewers, and most reviewers are not getting paid. Right now, some editors are getting paid to facilitate the process, but reviewers is just kind of like, I'm a faculty member at a university. And part of my service to the community, the larger community of science, is that I review journal articles. And it's not like I'm specifically getting paid for that. That's just part of the duties of being a professor. But professors are more and more strapped for time, right? We're teaching more classes. Class sizes are getting larger. There's a lot more things to do, a lot of higher expectations. It's like a lot of fields. It's become more difficult to sort of scratch out that time to do those particular reviews. And to be perfectly blunt, it's not like I get in trouble if I don't do those reviews, right? If I just hit the reject button, not the reject the article, but reject the I'm going to do the review button, right? Are you willing to do this? No, I don't have time to do this. I can just keep clicking that, right? And pass it on, and then they have to find somebody else to do it. And all of that leads to a crunch And that crunch, I completely understand, is going to lead to making it easier for individuals who want to be fraud, to cheat the system, right? To submit crappy articles just because they need an article. The other problem is there's a lot of pressure on some faculty at institutions to publish. A lot of small institutions, you have faculty members who are doing bits of research and they need to get a couple papers to get tenure. And then you have a lot of institutions, especially in other countries, where they need to have a couple publications. And so they're just sort of throwing out stuff to wherever they can. And this whole idea of having open access and paying to get your publication leads to these kinds of problems, right? It is leading to more and more bad articles being published. But I want to back up just a second. I just want to remind you that just because there are some bad articles doesn't mean there's not a lot of really good science. And the problem for Ken Ham is that he kind of uses these kind of, scare tactics to kind of like give you the impression like you can't trust science. You can't trust science overall. You can't trust scientists. Most of this stuff is in medical research, and social sciences and other. I don't want to say social science. I'll stick to medical. A lot of medical journals, lots and lots of clinical studies, and improperly done clinical studies. Especially, COVID. So many thousands of articles have been attempted to be published on COVID, and so many have been put together so quickly with really bad data and known fraudulent data. I'm thinking specifically of a bunch of data that came out of Brazil, where doctors claimed that they had done all these tests for ivermectin, and it turned out when they interviewed the actual places they listed in the journal article as to like which clinics and which wards or whatever the data came from, it's like they never even did it. Right? They never actually did any of that data collection, and so it was all made up. And that is terrible because it undermines the value of other people's research, because it creates a lack of trust. But as I said before, you have to go back and you have to remember that scientists who have long reputations for doing excellent work, especially, and the value of the tenure process is if you have tenure and you don't need to climb and prove yourself over and over again, you're just interested in learning more about that particular field, there isn't quite the same pressure, right, to manipulate data. The data is the data. So anyway, I'm sorry, I'm meandering now. Here he's quoting, here's Ken, let's go back to the article. Maybe that'll get me back on track. Here he's quoting that article from Life site. The problem is massive, and even when important papers are withdrawn, some continue to be cited and relied upon for further work. Science becomes a joke under such circumstances, with the possibility of real-world catastrophes if the phony results become the basis of real-world actions. Now, Ken Ham loves to see that, right? Because he's going to say that lots of real-world actions are the result of phony data and phony results, especially like climate change, because he thinks all that's like phony results. But now what I want Ken Ham to consider is what types of articles are being withdrawn. And is it paleontological research where people are describing fossils? There are a couple, famous examples of fraud, especially with some Chinese fossils. And Ken Ham will be quick to point those out. But there are hundreds of thousands of articles, paleontological articles, that form our basis of our knowledge of like the geological column and the fossils that are present and where they're present and so forth. And the amount of fraud in those is so small. It's tiny. It's descriptions of what people are seeing. And the incentive to lie about, this butterfly fossil that you found in the Eocene layer at the Green River Formation, there's no incentive to like make up a fossil and make up a description of it and publish it in order to somehow like support evolutionary theory. right? You're just describing things. Um, there's really no incentive to lie about radiometric dating results. Now, if you get into really sensitive areas like human fossils, right, which are much more touchy and people are much more like super conscious of it, and people, get famous for stuff, there can be more incentive, I'll say, for not being honest, right? Because pride and other things come into play there. Even there, I think there's plenty of honest people. And the other thing about that is the peer review process is super stringent for those articles, because no journal wants to be wrong, right? Wants to be shown that they published bad data and fraudulent data on really important topics like that. And so you can pretty much rely on the fact that the peer review process is going to be a lot of really good experts who are going to be looking at that and hashing over really important articles. But then when you look at the vast number of other things that aren't going to make it to the level of like flashy news stuff that you're going to hear about every day, the incentive to lie about that stuff, pretty low, right? This is something that somebody has dreamt of working on their whole life, and they're just really interested in it themselves. And the answer, like what the conclusion is not necessarily something that like somebody has like this preconceived notion that I absolutely have to show that the world is billions of years old, so therefore I'm going to manipulate this data. No, that's not really an issue at all. That's not in their mind as they're doing this type of research. So here's the thing. The things that Ken Ham cares about, most of the things that Ken Ham cares about and thinks that science is wrong about, are not really areas that are manipulate or subject to a lot of the type of fraud that he's talking about here. All right, a lot of the fraud that we're talking about and where you end up with tons of things being retracted because they haven't been properly peer reviewed and so forth are in these open access journals of zillions of little tiny clinical studies or descriptions of things in which those things have been improperly done, or that you have people that are just making up data and doing stuff because it's really hot topics and it's like really important stuff, and they want to have their name cited, and they want to, they want to be hired by a company or get a patent, or right. There's a lot of money involved in those things. There's not a whole lot of money in paleontology, right, and earth science research. So it's the incentives there for cheating the system aren't as great. Okay, let's go down. In other words, peer review, which is supposed to ensure only solid research is published, is open to corruption. Wow, that's like such an incredible insight by Ken Ham. It's open to corruption. Of course it is. I mean, what human system isn't open to corruption? And as he says there, this should not be surprising to us Christians. Like, we Christians, we're not surprised by this because we know that all sin, that all Christians are sinners, and everyone is a sinner, right? And is corrupt in some way. So even a scientist is a sinner with a deceptive heart and often very selfish, has selfish motives. So what's the solution? What's the solution Ken Ham provides? Atheist mock articles in the Answers in Genesis Research Journal. Now, I'm not an atheist. And although it sounds like I'm mocking the Answers Research Journal, I'll call it, I have some spirited criticisms of the Answers Research Journal. And I'll put it this way. My criticisms are meant to try to make the Answers Research Journal better. In other words, I'm providing an evaluation of the Answers Research Journal in the hopes that they'll reflect upon how they do things and make the journal better. I'm not just saying everything in there is a joke. There's decently published data in the Answers Research Journal. But I think that they suffer from a lot of the same problems that some very low-end journals suffer from in the secular scientific world. All right, so he says, atheist mock articles, they claim that we should have them peer-reviewed by secular scientists. See, here he's going to say, here's where, without actually saying it, he's intimating that here's another reason why we don't really need to have other scientists review our journals, like our articles. We don't need to have their peer review. We just need our own peer review. It's because, look, they're fraudulent anyway. Why would we trust them? Because they already manipulate the data. They're not going to be fair with the data. They can't even get their own peer review system right. And so why would we trust them to peer review our stuff? Now, here's where I'm more than a little bit frustrated. I know of several cases, all right, in which I know people personally who have reviewed Answers in Genesis or other young earth creationist journal articles, all right, and they're not young earth creationists. So they've been asked, because they're in that same field and they're Christians, and they've been asked to provide some kind of review as one of the peer reviewers for their journals. And this is a fair number of years back. And those individuals have told me that after doing peer review, they were very critical. They found a number of, it's not just critical of like the concept or their conclusions, right? Their interpretations, which obviously they're going to come to an interpretive, they're going to interpret it within a young earth context. And so not being young earth creationists, they're probably going to interpret the data in a different way. No, their criticisms also just had to do with the way the data is being presented and the missing data that's there, how the data was collected. All right, some fundamental flaws in the scientific process. In other words, what a peer reviewer should be doing. Was this project even done properly such that the results that you get can be interpreted in the way you're interpreting them? And so they've provided those criticisms, and then they've seen that article come out actually in press in the Answers Research Journal or one of the other journals that Young Earth Creationists run. And they've noticed that none of their critiques have been addressed. Maybe they've changed something grammatically where they made a grammatical change, but they haven't changed any like fundamental thing that they thought was fundamentally wrong with the article. Right? Now that to me is a failure of the peer review process. Right? If you're not going to listen to the peer reviewer and you're not going to consider their evaluation, then is it really peer reviewed? Technically, you can say it's peer reviewed because peers looked at it. But if the peers have no influence on the end product, then really it's not peer reviewed. It's just the editor saying, this article is okay. We're going to publish it no matter what. Right? This is the same complaint that we have against some of the lower end tiered journals, where maybe they are reviewed, but the reviews are so light that they don't really say anything. Or maybe you get an improper reviewer. So, I'm asked to review a journal article on hematology, and I know zero about it. I know nothing about it. I'm just a scientist with a PhD, so therefore, let's get you to review it. I can't even really critique it. I don't know what their methods are. I don't understand that data. I don't know the statistics, right? I don't know the background. I can just read it and go like, it sounds reasonable. That's not really a very good peer review, is it? And that's what happens with a lot of articles. That's why the better journals are better journals, is because they can attract people who actually know what they're talking about and really know the type of evidence they're looking at and can be true peer reviewers. And that's where we get to, here's what the problem with Answers in Genesis is. They're not going to use external peer reviewers, meaning outside of young earth creationism. How many peer reviewers are there within the young earth creationist world? Like, how many are there? There are only so many PhDs. And you've heard me say many times before, you can be a non-PhD and be an expert in something. You can devote a lot of attention to something and learn a lot, and you could probably be a perfectly good peer reviewer. And I wouldn't have a problem with Answers in Genesis used non-PhD, non-masters as reviewers. But they have to know that particular field, and not just that field, they have to understand that particular type of evidence. And they probably should have some experience actually collecting that type of evidence and analyzing it themselves, not just having read a lot of other articles. And Answers in Genesis doesn't have that. They publish articles all the time in which I look at and I go, there's probably only one other creationist scientist in the world that would even have any idea what this person is talking about. And so whatever they wrote is probably just what's right in the article. It's not been reviewed. It's not been vetted, other than maybe grammatically. To go back to this, so he says, at least our reviewers are Christians who strive for truthfulness and accuracy. And it's like, well, you're not a Christian, so you're not really interested in accuracy and truthfulness, or at least not to the level we are. We're Christians, and we strive for truthfulness and accuracy in our journal. And you could say, okay, all right, so you have a heightened sense of being accurate. But I'll just remind you that they're still sinners, and they still have agendas. And certainly for Answers in Genesis, you have to toe a certain line if you're going to publish in their journal. And there are people, especially at maybe Christian colleges, who need to publish a paper once in a while to show some kind of activity, what do you call it? Professional activity. And to do that, maybe you need to publish. There's only so many young earth creationist journals out there. And so you're going to need to fit your perspective into what they expect, because you can't just be coming out with conclusions that contradict, the stated statement of faith of Answers in Genesis. So there is a tendency, right, to manipulate or reword your results in order to fit their particular agenda. That's going to happen. And there's just plain, they want to be able to publish journal articles, and they kind of don't care what they say as long as they toe the line. Are they more accurate? Check out our Cutting Edge Research Journal at answersresearchjournal.org. Cutting Edge Research. Whew. Let's go back up to the beginning here, and let me review. Ken Ham calls into question the process of peer review, which is sort of at the core of what establishes the legitimacy of results that scientists produce. And so he's really trying to cut down into the very underpinning of how science functions and works on a practical way. He does that, though, by citing an article from a website that in itself has a very strong agenda, let's put it that way, in which this opinion piece is very much trying to sway someone's opinion. Ken Ham is very susceptible to having his opinion swayed in this particular direction, because he values and trusts the other types of misinformation which are on this particular website, because those are his values and the things that he believes. And therefore, he has placed a certain trust value in an article like this without really understanding the peer review process, without really understanding how science works, without actually having done science. And so he has placed his faith, his trust in some unknown actor. And then uses this to then communicate to a much broader audience as an expert himself. Like, I am teaching you what you should know about science. Here's how we do science. Here's how they do science. Here's why you should trust us. It's like adding one bit of information, informing another piece of misinformation, informing something else. It just gets worse over time. Ken Ham is so far divorced from being able to connect to the reality of the real world that he doesn't even understand when he's being manipulated, right? And his thoughts are being manipulated. Answers Research Journal is subject to all the same kinds of problems that many secular scientist journals are subject to. And because they have, and I'll say that they have a bigger problem because they have even fewer experts. And so therefore their peer review process really is not going to be as robust. And just remind you, there is a spectrum of robustness within secular science, from really not robust at all to being very robust. And a scientist worth anything is able to recognize that spectrum, and they're able to evaluate literature and determine what literature they're really going to trust because of valid reputation, and which literature that they might accept if they personally know something about that particular research, but they're going to have a certain healthy amount of skepticism. In the young earth creationist world, there's very few journals. There's very few options for somebody publishing. And if the quality of none of them is all that great, in other words, they're more down on this end of the spectrum where they don't have enough reviewers, you wonder what the review process really is like. I really think that a lot of it is determined a lot by, like, I know this person, I trust this person, they submitted this article, I read it, sounds good to me, let's publish it. That's not really peer review. I think that goes on a lot. It definitely goes on in the secular world, in this end of the pendulum, end of the spectrum. And I think that represents a good portion of what's happening in young earth creationism as well. I've experienced the same thing. Like I said, I've published, I don't know what I'm at, 52, 53 peer-reviewed articles in a wide variety of different journals. And I've had, huge amounts of effort to get into some journals because of the back and forth over and over and over with different reviewers. And I would say in many of those cases, the final product is so much better than what I originally submitted because of that peer review process. And I've had some manuscripts that have had relatively what I would consider fairly light review. And sometimes those articles, they're pretty straightforward. There wasn't a lot to review anyway. Some of them, I think, deserved more review and didn't get very much review and eventually got published. And I would say they're not my best articles, but they're also not in the best journals, right? There's very much a correlation between the quality of the journal and the amount of effort, right, that it took in order to get something published in that particular journal. And so, once again, one has to be cognizant of the variety of publication outlets in the world of scientific publishing, and realize that there's apples and oranges out there, and to understand that. And Ken Ham just has zero nuance for this kind of thing at all. He wants to paint in super broad brushes and be able to just like illegitimate and legitimate. It's kind of like everything with him. It's like you either go all the way with young earth creationist, and that's the only way to understand the world, or you're just an atheist, right? There's nothing in between other than compromisers who haven't figured out that they're on one side or the other. Everything is black and white. I'm rambling now. I never know how to end. I don't really have a final statement. So let's just go down to the bottom here. Hey, my name's Joel Duff. I do this type of stuff. I think this peer review process is a pretty, overall, it's a nice system. It's got warts. It's got problems. But the alternative isn't all that great, because you've seen the alternative. The alternative is websites with opinion pieces. I can just publish whatever I want, and I can throw out whatever data I want, and it's left up to the user to look at and go like, do I trust that data or not? And how do you figure out whether you trust it or not? Like, how are you going to do that? You had no other people who reviewed it. You don't have anyone else telling you that this is legitimate. It would be a free-for-all of just like, I could do whatever and say whatever I want, and as long as I convince somebody else that that's true, then that would make me popular, right? That would make my particular view become more common than someone else's particular view. Does this sound like I'm describing anything in the world today? Like, this is the way that the world operates in terms of politics and all other things, right? It's just like whoever's the loudest has the big platform. It doesn't matter how many times somebody's shown to be wrong, as long as they can make someone else think that they're right with whatever they say and whatever data they use. And they can even use bad data. And they can always say, well, I was given bad data, or I didn't know that was bad. They have excuses, right? If you really work in the area of science and you really do try to publish manuscripts and you go through the peer review process, you really will recognize how awful other systems can be in terms of the truth value in them and where you derive your trust in information. I wish everyone would write a manuscript, collect some data, and try the peer review process out. And sure, you would find that there's problems with it, but you would appreciate what it's done for us over time as well. All right, I'm going to quit there. Yeah, that's Ken Ham talking about the peer review process, complaining about the peer review process, and my thoughts on the Interest Research Journal. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.